The 5-foot frame that comes with your machine comes with a series of clamps used to load your quilt onto the frame. The first and the largest clamp is called the Deluxe Quilt Clamp. You also have 6 easy grasp quilt clamps with handles and 6 quilt clamps, 3 large and 3 small. These are used to place the quilt onto the frame, to clamp it onto the frame nice and tight, while these are used to roll up the quilt as you progress in your quilting. The marvelous thing about this 5-foot frame is that although it is only 5 feet and can fit virtually anywhere, it can quilt a small quilt, like a baby quilt or even a block or two, to a king-size quilt using this system of clamps. Let me show you how. Before you load your quilt onto the frame, it's essential that you create a quilt sandwich. What a quilt sandwich is first the layer that you've pieced, the top part of the quilt, followed by the batting, and lastly the backing. Now you can sandwich a quilt using adhesive spray, or some people choose to hand-based or machine-based, or even using pins. Once you have sandwiched your quilt, you will need to provide an area of at least 6 inches between the quilt top to the end of where the batting and the backing meet. The reason why this is very important is because this will allow space for us to clamp and anchor the quilt onto the frame. So when we start to clamp, the first thing is we need to make sure that our quilt top is within the range of the sewing needle. So I can see that I can quilt the very top and I can quilt along the edge. In this case, it would be basting the edges before I start quilting. When clamping down your quilt on the frame, it's very important to place your clamps in a strategic position. This is perhaps the most important one because this anchors your quilt and lines it up nice and parallel to this pole of the frame. Next, I will take another clamp and place it directly in front of this clamp, creating a nice surface to begin. I'm going to move along here. The easiest way to install the Deluxe Quilt Clamp is to open it slightly in one corner, place it on the pole, and slowly work your way down. I'm going to put one clamp here, and let's not forget to place one clamp along the farthest right hand corner of the quilt. As you can see, this gives me a really great working surface to start quilting. Something very important is when you're placing your quilt sandwich on the frame, you want to make sure that you have enough space to baste the top and the sides, which as we can see, we do. Now I'm going to show you how it is that we quilt a large quilt on just a 5-foot frame. So when I am shifting the quilt over, so let's say I have quilted this entire area, I'm going to leave this clamp in position. This will then be my anchoring clamp when I'm shifting the quilt. So I'll take all of these other clamps off, and this is a great place to store them while you're not using them until you're ready to quilt. So I'm going to take all of the clamps off, leaving this one on the far right hand corner. Again, I lift one corner and take it off. I will then hold on to the clamp and simply shift over the quilt, making sure that I have adjusted my quilt underneath the needle. Now, it is very, very important and crucial with this frame that the quilt only remain on top of this pole. No amount of fabric or quilt goes underneath. It always remains on top. Make sure that no amount of fabric goes inside this clamp. You'll see a little happy face with the indicator buttons on there, or images. You want to make sure that it's on a happy smile. That means that this pole is locked into place. Again, no amount of fabric should ever be going underneath this clamp. It always stays on top. So now that my quilt is in position, I'll do the same thing. I'll come over here and place one clamp on the left-hand side and work myself over from this side over, making sure that the tension on my quilt is nice and firm, not too tight as to create a trampoline effect, but just enough to create some tension so that I can continue quilting. Now, one of the things that I have found with these clasps are that when you point them directly in a 12 o'clock position, meaning straight up, like this, it really does create quite a nice flat surface to quilt on. All right. One small tip when aligning your quilt is to remember that the actual sewing area, meaning where your needle can start to sew to where it stops sewing, is 12 inches by 48 inches. So every quilt piece is different. So as you align your quilt, for example, if I just want to stitch a pattern on this area, or let's say I wanted to make sure that my hearts on this quilt were completely visible, I want to make sure that I'm aligning my quilt as I clamp it down within the actual sewing area, which in this case is 12 inches by 48. So the positioning of your quilt is important because then as you strategically think about the design that you're incorporating onto your quilt, you actually have space to follow through with that design. Now we're going to advance our quilt forward, and we're going to talk about a few things to keep in mind as we're doing that. So the first step in advancing the quilt is to take off the clamps. Now I'm going to advance my quilt forward. Because I finished one complete line, meaning that I moved my quilt over to the right, I'm ready to go back and start again. So I'm going to come back to the left-hand side of my quilt, advance it forward, make sure that the edge of my quilt top is within reach of my sewing area. And this looks good because you will see that when you bring your machine all the way over, it stops. The frame will stop it from keeping moving. So you will see that I'm making sure that the top of my quilt has enough space to start, and I do have enough space. So what I'm going to do first is place my first anchoring clamp. So using the Easy Grasp quilt clamp, I'm going to attach the anchoring. Now I'm going to place one directly in front of that one. And I find it's better to do the extremity, so start with the left and then you can come on to the right and make sure that it's aligned nice and straight. So I'm going to put one clamp there, one clamp here, making sure to put one at the very end on the right side, one in the middle. And using my Deluxe quilt clamp, I'll open it to one side and slowly bring it over. I move these up so that they're facing directly up, sort of in a 12 o'clock position. And now I have a flat surface ready to quilt. Now that I have advanced my quilt forward, you will find that I have a lot of quilt fabric that is hanging over. This is a part of my quilt that's already been quilted. Again, a quick reminder that the fabric always stays on the top of this sturdy pole. So, taking our small and large quilt clamps that I find are very easy to store on the frame, you will find that these quilt clamps fit perfectly on the easy grasp quilt clamps. And the way this works is when you fold up the quilted part of your quilt, you will use these clamps to hold down neatly all of the quilting that you've already completed. You'll find that the little ones as well can hold the quilt independently without having necessarily to go on the easy grasp clamps. So what we find is now I am ready to quilt along my quilting space, free of any quilt being in my way, and it's nice and neat.